All right, thank you all for attending today's program. The first thing that I would like to say is we'd like to thank all of our extension partners, because without them, we would not be able to provide programs like the ones we're providing today. So we thank all of our partners. A couple of housekeeping items. Please stay muted. If you would like to ask a question, please, you can either enter it into the chat box, or you can raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to ask your question live to Anita. Also, closed captioning is enabled today. You can turn it on and off in your meeting controls. And thank you for attending. And I think we're going to get started. So I'm going to stop sharing so that Anita can. And Dave, it's now yours.
Great. Thanks, Karen. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker for today, and that's Dr. Anita Oberholster. Of course, usually Anita is part of the office hours with Dave and Anita host team, but Karen has agreed to do that today, so thank you to Karen. Should also thank Caroline Furman, both of them, Karen and Caroline, for organizing the session today. So for Anita, I think most of you on the line probably know Anita well by this point. She's a Cooperative Extension Specialist in Enology in our department at UC Davis. She's been with us for just over 10 years now, and has helped us to grow our programs in extension programs in viticulture and enology. I will say, not to embarrass her, but she was just chosen this year to win the Extension Award, Extension Distinction Award, I have to say that right, from American Society for Enology and Viticulture, and she also won the Distinguished Service Award from the Academic Federation here at UC Davis for her work and extension. So we're very happy to have her here, and I'm going to turn it over to her to give us some introductory comments. If you have questions, again, like Karen said, put your questions in chat or get them ready to ask when she's done. And we'll either ask them or call on you to ask them if you would like to actually ask a question yourself. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anita.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to quickly share my screen. Okay, so, sorry, too many things open. I'm just trying to find the right screen where I am. So, where's presenter mode now? Let me just, I am where I'm supposed to be. You'll think I should.
It looks fine.
Okay, so I'm going to give, I was told that they're going to be literally kick me off if I'm longer than 20 minutes so that people have plenty of time to ask questions. So I'm hopefully going to be even shorter than that. I am going to start with the basics. I found when I don't give the basics, then there's sometimes a little bit of a misunderstanding about the basic science. And then if I just talk about the applied stuff, something gets lost in translation. So most of you know by now, when there's a wildfire and you have a lot of wood burning, 15 to 25% of wood is actually consists of lignin. It gives wood its structure. And if you look at the structure that's shown there on the left, you will see that when that burns, you actually get a lot of volatile phenols being released, right? It breaks down. And this is an example of one of the volatile phenols, that's guaiacol. So basically, the volatile phenols get released into the air and they're carried away on air currents, ash, and other debris. And when it reaches a vineyard, it can absorb onto mainly the leaves and the grapes. And this absorption happens very fast. So volatile phenols enter the skin and they're glycosylated within the skin by glycosyl transferase enzymes very quickly. Those of us that has done a sampling over time can tell you that it happens within hours. And then you can have a range of different mono, di, and triglycosides attaching themselves to the volatile phenols. So now we're talking about both the free and the bound form, because when it doesn't have a sugar attached to it, it is aromatic. You can smell it. As soon as there's sugar attached to it, it is not volatile anymore, so you can't smell it anymore. Now, naturally present in all different grape varieties, you also have both free and bound present naturally, but the amount will always be such that will not result in what we call smoke taint or smoke impact. As it's when you have an excessive amount, as when you have a wildfire event, smoke absorbing onto the grapes, and that free and bound number goes beyond what is natural, that you can start having a problem resulting in wines that can show a smoke impact. So these are the main 7 free volatile phenols that we're currently analyzing. And then you also have a set of bound volatile phenols, 6 main bound volatile phenols that the commercial labs are analyzing. Most researchers are analyzing way more than those, trying to see which ones are the best predictors of smoke taint. And that work is actually still ongoing. So something I wanted to mention was, people ask me, so what do we test for? What's the best test? So you get your free volatile phenols, and it's better. This is a question of the more data points you have, the better, because the data is already not as predictive as we would like it to be. Because you have a natural amount. We don't know for different grape varieties in different regions, what is normal range for free? What is normal range for bound? So it's already very difficult to interpret data if you don't know what the baseline, what normal is. And then we don't know exactly how much elevated do you need to actually result in a problem. Just a little bit may not result in a problem. We're only concerned where it starts impacting the quality of the resulting wine. So you really want to analyze as much as possible and have as many data points as possible. So for free volatile phenols, we really recommend that you get the whole range, all 7 at least of the main compounds. We have seen good correlation sometimes with just alcohol and 4-methyl alcohol with the rest, but they're actually not the strongest indicators. Your cresols, for instance, are also very strong indicators of smoke impact. Then you have labs that do total volatile phenols. So that is when they mostly do an acid hydrolysis. They release everything that is bound, and you have that plus what was free originally to give you a total number. And then you get labs that do the individual bound volatile phenols. Not a lot of labs do these because they're very laborious and they take a very long time and they're pretty expensive to do. I would definitely recommend getting the bound numbers as well. So if you can do total and free, and then you can subtract and get an idea of what was bound, because we do see instances, and we don't know if this relates to time of smoke exposure, where you have very, very little free, but massive amounts of bounds. And think of another respect as well. For wine, because during the winemaking process, a lot of the bound can become free over time. You need to know what is there. What is the potential reservoir of free volatile phenols that can impact the quality of your wine over its lifetime, especially when you're even thinking of treatment options. Yes, you remove this, but how much is still left there? Is what's left there going to be problematic or not? So basically, the more extensive testing you can do, the better. I do realize these things cost money and the tests aren't always available, but if you have a choice, the more extensive, the better. So we've seen that volatile phenols are in the skins. So for red wines, we really move to just make the best red wine you can, because they extract very quickly. They're very hydrophilic. They dissolve in wine very quickly, a little bit like anthocyanins. So we've seen 80% within 5 days at 25 degrees Celsius fermentation. We see slow hydrolysis over time from the bound to the free. We've observed something in the range of 25 to 30% release until after post-malolactic fermentation. I've seen up to 35%. It depends on the variety, how much was in there to begin with, and obviously your matrix conditions as well. And something to remember, both free and bound contribute to smoke taint perception. So in the beginning, people weren't that concerned about the bound, but we know now that most people have bacterial enzymes in their saliva that can actually hydrolyze the bound compounds. We don't know exactly how much gets hydrolyzed in your mouth, but that definitely free it in your mouth and contributes to that ashtray character that we perceive when you taste a smoke impacted wine. So you need to be concerned about both the free and the bound, and not just what can become free during the lifetime of the wine, but also actually what can be released during tasting of the wine. We do know matrix effects have a huge impact. So that's the other thing. You can have two wines and the marker compound compositions for smoke taint look exactly the same, but the expression of smoke taint is not the same, because alcohol decreases the impact. Greenness, methoxypyrazines increases the impact. Fruitiness can decrease the impact. Sugar as low as 3 grams per liter can actually help decrease the impact because of the enzyme gets inhibited that releases and hydrolyzes the bound in your mouth. So everything has a synergistic impact on everything else. So at this stage, we're saying the best for mitigation, white wines, gentle processing. I know it's not always possible, but if you can, handpicking. Obviously, volatile phenols are mostly in the skins. So with white wines, you still have the option of having as little skin contact as possible so that you don't actually release the volatile phenols that's been absorbed into the skins. Light pressing, keep press fractions separate. If you think it's impacted, there is the potential that you can already do some fining in the juice and build back some of the aroma that you lost due to fining during the winemaking process. And fruity yeast, like we said, a little bit of body and fruity yeast can definitely try and help covering up some of the smoke, but it's usually a pretty short-term solution. So in whites, it's definitely all about having as little skin contact as possible if you think you have a smoke exposure problem. For red grapes, because that doesn't really make sense, right? You're now talking about a Blanc de Noir or Rosé, and it doesn't always make economical sense. Something else to remember, that even with the Rosé, you want some color. And because you have a simpler matrix, even though you have much less of the volatile phenols, that doesn't mean that it won't stand out because your matrix is simpler. So a lower concentration of these marker compounds could have a larger impact because they're less suppressed. But otherwise, if you think you potentially have smoke impact for your red wines, fruity yeast, light tasted oak, something that has no smoky or related aromas, you really want to uplift the smoke, add some uplift the fruit, add some complexity that can hide any potential smokiness that may be there. I found that most of these things have a very small impact. And this is really when you're just really suspecting there may be something. Medium to high impacted wine, obviously, it just won't be enough. I know of other people that have had the inventory that they could actually just press from the skins and donate skins that haven't been impacted after fermentation to actually still get their color and their tannin out. That's always an option because we know that during a standard fermentation, you do not actually get all the color and tannin from your skin. So it's still there, or at least 50% many times remain. Something to remember, the moment your wine see any kind of oak contact, even neutral barrels or untoasted, your free number has very little meaning, your free volatile phenol number. We cannot predict how much free volatile phenols comes from oak. Okay, even neutral oaks still do contribute to those numbers. So you need to be aware of that. If you need to do future testing, you may want to keep some wines separate. Like I said, I've done some of my own tests. And I found for mitigation, things extract very quickly. And there's small things you can do for very, very low impact, but otherwise just make the wine, best wine you can, and stop and focus more on immunomoduration options. I've looked at some enzymes. They don't really do any harm, but I haven't found them really releasing an extensive amount of free volatile phenols in the wines that I've tested. And the current amelioration techniques, there's a lot of options there that do help. They do remove some of the free volatile phenols, less of the bound, unfortunately. For, I think, low to medium impact, it can actually give you a wine that's not smoke impacted, although the quality may be decreased overall. For medium to high impact, amelioration just can't get there. You're going to have to do several amelioration steps after each other. I'm not sure whether that wine wouldn't then be so impacted that it's just not worthwhile to do all these treatments. We'll continue looking at this because there's always new options coming up that we will evaluate here at our winery as well, and we will share what works. But at this stage, activated charcoal, reverse osmosis, and in spinning cone, they all do work to a certain extent. We've also looked at molecular imprinted polymers. They're now going through the process to get it safe to use. They've also showed some real potential. I've looked at it chemically, it works really well, even a little bit better than activated charcoal. I wasn't able to do any kind of sensory evaluations on it. That's the next step to see what the overall quality impact is. But there is a lot of options out there and they're worth testing out. So we did harvest trials in 2020. And so what I wanted to say is we looked at how does bucket fermentations, and Tom Collins at Washington State University did a lot of this as well. And he saw the same thing, which is good news. We really did a study on, okay, how does bucket fermentations actually relate to larger fermentations? Can you really use a bucket fermentation to predict the smoke impact? And does the chemical composition of the marker compounds relate to what you see in larger fermentations? And it does. It does really relate to each other. And Tom Collins found the same thing. You know, the bucket fermentations that have been, now I can't get it on the word, recommended by the Australian Wine Research Institute, but they actually have never done an extensive study to compare it to larger scale to see that it actually predicts well. I think they did some last year. We also looked at microfermentations where we actually use French presses, both 375 mils and 750 mils. And we used it like a submerged cap. And I can tell you that they actually related very well to microfermentations or bucket fermentations as well. Actually, most of the time we got a little bit more extraction, probably because of the smaller volume and just getting better contact between skins and the juice. We also tried to see if we could speed up fermentation. We used high biomass and high nitrogen. That combo worked the best. Basically used double the amount of yeast we normally use, 2 grams per gallon. And then we aimed for a yan of 500. And we found that it could speed up. For the limited fermentations that we compared, this is just like 3 different wines. We found it really related well to the smoke exposure, the standard bucket fermentation protocol. It could finish many fermentations within 3 days if you use this. We also looked what people call the Savy method. That is a 66 degrees Celsius with 10% alcohol. So you're not actually doing a fermentation. Chemically, that related for the small amount of wines where we tested it. It was also just 2-3 wines. So that has potential. What we haven't done is we haven't tasted these wines yet. So because we haven't been able to do sensory. So I can't tell you in a sensory how well it compares to bucket, but definitely chemically, it does seem to compare well. We also started looking at different varietals, comparing doing bucket fermentations and grape analysis, and we will go back this year to get baseline, hopefully, for these sites. So anybody that gave me grapes last year, I'm going to come back to you and ask you for baseline for this year, but I can't get grapes from any new people because our freezers are full, so I'm going to struggle to actually accept this year's inventory as it is. And also, Sue Ebler and myself got a grant to start with baseline for several varieties from several regions. And we list the varieties there, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Merlot, Zinfandel, Syrah, Chardonnay, and Sauvignon Blanc. We already have all the grapes we need that we can handle. Actually, we got 3 times more than we can handle. And so hopefully we can start on baseline for at least those 7 varieties for a few regions. And we hope to continue that work in the coming years. So current recommendations. So basically take a berry sample close to harvest if you have any smoke exposure concerns. People have asked me if they can take samples earlier. The problem is the limited data that's available where people have sampled grapes during ripening and where they actually looked at volatile phenols as well. It seems to change over the ripeness period. So this is why close to harvest is still the safest, so that you can compare it with your actual harvest samples. If you take samples, freeze some of it so that you can revisit it later if you need to. It's really important. Smaller fermentations, it's still the same as last year, 30 to 40 clusters per vine. The larger your sample set, obviously the more representative. Riper is better, but it's not always possible. You can taste smoke taint in unripe berries. It's just harder because of the acidity to see it, but a well-trained panel can actually do that. We recommend that you pre-train the people that's going to evaluate bucket fermentations for you, and that you even decide now what kind of harvest decisions you're going to make. How are you going to determine whether you pick or not pick, and what parameters are you going to use to decide on smoke impact and whether you accept grapes or don't accept grapes. I've talked about the sensory evaluations. This has changed a little, evolved over time, as I've done some sensory myself and talked to the Australians that have done a lot of this as well. So you have to, if you select people from your winery or as a group of wineries that gets together to do sensory, you have to screen people whether they can actually evaluate smoke taint. 20 to 25% of people can't see smoke taint. And you do this by having an impacted wine, but I also suggest having a non-impacted wine, a control wine, because you also get people that's overly sensitive to smoke and see it everywhere. That you don't want either. If you have a panel, the more the better, obviously. More than 5 is really recommended to evaluate smoke impact. Randomize your samples, have a control, have something that's a duplicate. We don't actually look at more than 6 samples at a time, and then we take a 10-minute break before we start the next set. And you really do have to rinse with water and wait at least 2 minutes. There is a huge carryover for smoke taint from one sample to the next. So if you taste a heavily impacted wine in the beginning, everything else is going to taste smoky if you do not wait at least 2 minutes before you evaluate the next one. I suggest using a simple 9-point rating scale and only rating in the mouth, because you sometimes have wines that have nothing on the nose, but when you taste it, it's there. It's always in the palate if it exists. So it just simplifies the evaluation process. So here is an example of a sheet that I made. We always say others if somebody noticed something else, but it's just a rating of smoke taint. And the smoke taint evaluation is really based only on parameters or attributes that we associate with smoke taint. So sometimes I see winemakers would want to evaluate a wine on something because they think the quality isn't what it should be, or they assume an impact. It really has to be based on known smoke taint parameters or attributes, not on something that they associate with it. So it really needs to be the medicinal, the smoky, the ashy, the barbecue, bacon kind of aromas by mouth. It's really very distinctive, and it just makes it easier for everybody to evaluate wines on the same criteria. Otherwise, you get a lot of variability, and this is why it's so important to train people. It's much harder than you think it is to consistently rate smoke taint and just ignore everything else that can impact your evaluation of the wines, your perception of what the quality should be, and just rate for smoke impact itself or known smoke impact. Okay, I think I went long. I know I went long. I'm sorry. And they didn't kick me off. So I just need to thank the people that have been sponsoring the work that I've been doing. Obviously, without money, we can't do anything. And now we'll answer some questions.
Great.
And stop sharing.
I did, we didn't kick you off, but I did actually just ask Karen, do you think she's almost done? But thank you for keeping almost within the 20 minutes. Appreciate that. So at this point, we'll start off by asking some questions, but please, if you have questions, either raise your hand electronically or put your question in chat. We'll read it. But while you're doing that, let me kind of kick off by asking Anita first question. You talked about baseline a couple times, and I'm wondering, would you recommend that people, let's say they don't have wildfires this year, would you recommend that they just take samples this year to create their own baseline? And how should they do that if it is a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a very good idea. I mean, I understand that it costs a lot of money. And, you know, for insurance purposes, they want every variety, every block separate. But if you're doing it for yourself for baseline, if you have one variety and a lot of blocks and they're very similar, you can just take one large composite sample. I personally, because there's even within a vine and within a cluster, there's a lot of variability. If you analyze the different berries separately, you look at their volatile phenol content, it's very, very different. So to get a representative sample, I do cluster sampling as of many vines as I can. I just strip the berries of it, mix it up, and I take those berries to actually make my composite sample for analysis. So if you are composing a sample that you want to actually send to a lab, that's what I would suggest doing. You know, you fill a gallon bag with clusters, you strip it off, you mix it up, and from that, you get the sample that you send for analysis. And just do it for your main varieties. And perhaps, and if you have multiple varieties, then only for vineyards then that, or say the same variety, multiple vineyards, do it for the vineyards that's quite far apart or very different, so that you can get an idea of the vineyards you use, what is the range of normal, and then use a lab that will give you at least total as well, so that you have both free and bound numbers. That is the lab that you need to stick to. That's the other thing. Lab numbers won't be identical because the analysis methods are different. They will relate to each other and they will correlate, but it won't give this the same value. So it's good to find a lab and stick to a lab if you can, because you can compare that data more directly to each other.
We do have a question in the chat. How long after smoke exposure should samples be collected?
You know, because absorbance actually happens so quickly and glycosylation happens so quickly, you can actually do it within a day or two. You know, it could evolve. This is the other thing. So it's not based on an excessive amount of research. So we have seen sometimes that the bound versus free ratio can still change with ripeness, but you can do it within a day or two, and that should give you a very good idea. But there may be small changes, but it's not going to create more volatile phenols. And obviously, here's the thing. While there is smoke exposure, you obviously want to wait until the smoke exposure is gone, because while there is smoke there, there's always the potential of the volatile phenols to continue absorbing onto the grapes. So because testing is expensive, you don't want to test and then have to retest and have to retest. So this is why we often tell people, hang on as long as you can, close to when you need to harvest, and then do analysis. But the caveat there and the problem there is obviously if there's a lot of fires and everybody waits and then there's backlogs in the lab and you can't get your results back to make a harvest decision. And this is how we got to the bucket ferments, right? But I would say the bucket ferments really for us is a pain, but is recommended with the chemical analysis, just because chemical analysis, it's still difficult to interpret, especially the maybe, maybe not, this low impact range. And that's where sensory evaluations of the wines can really give you that additional data point to make an informed decision.
Great. Here's another question in the chat. Assuming budget is not an issue, would you recommend running bound concentrations by LCMS or run free and total by GCMS and back out the bound concentration?
It's difficult. So, you know, the Australian Wine Research Institute probably has the best data over time. And they do the free and the bound separate. They don't do total. The problem with total is it's easier to do, but it has a lot of variability in it because of the process. And we don't really know yet how well individual bound and the total, exactly how well they correlate. Because when you do total, we don't know if it's excessive because it's an extreme hydrolysis process trying to release everything that's there. But will that always all release? Will all of that always have an impact on your wine? So this is why we're sort of saying stick to a method and get an idea of what is normal with that analysis. And then when you end up, sometimes have smoke impacted wines, what's the number for those wines? And you start getting an idea of what gives you a taint and what is your normal range so that you can get an idea. If there's no budget issues, do all analysis. That's what the researchers, you know, that's what I do. I just don't have enough data to tell you which one. I would say a bound number is good. Individual bound, the AWRI swear by it and say it works well, the 7 that they use. So either total or bound, if you have to choose. I think so long as you just free is problematic for me because there's a huge fraction then that you don't know. It's that unknown of how much bound. So total or individual bound, either or both if you have lots of money and time.
With respect to bucket fermentations of white wines, should we follow the same protocols as for reds?
So I did some bucket fermentations for white wines, both with skins, without skins, settled, not settled, rakers included. And obviously, when you do a white wine with skins, which is the standard bucket protocol, that is excessive, right? This is like worst case scenario. So I understand that some people do that, but I would think personally, to use something, a bucket protocol that's closer to what you're actually doing in your winery, what's your winemaking style, makes more sense. We saw that if we included the skins, we got like 3 times the amount of free, 1.5 to 2 times the amount of bound. And this is in small scale. I have to say this, people asked me last year about rakers. What about rakers? So we included rakers for Torrontés, Sauvignon Blanc, and Cabernet Sauvignon, and it really did not contribute to the volatile phenol numbers. So I think it's only 3 different wines that I made this way, but I did not see a significant increase in bound or free volatile phenols due to the rakers. So I think that is not a contributing factor. So we don't have to worry about that. People that were doing whole cluster pressing, etc., were concerned about that. So I think I would, for my own, develop white wine protocol that's similar to whatever I do in my winery for my white wine production.
There's another follow-on question in the chat. Am I correct that we should wait for Brix to reach 23 before sampling or analyzing the background concentrations?
So, you know, that's what we're doing for our baseline survey we're doing now. For a select few sites, I'm actually sampling during ripening because I want to see what is actually happening during ripening with the volatile phenol amounts. Because when I say the data that's out there showed that it changes, this is people that were really looking at monoterpenes and norisopronoids, you know, positive aroma compounds. And in their screening, they did also track some volatile phenols. So in that data, it looks like it varies over ripening. So just to be safe, we're sort of aiming at that 23, 25, because that's really the time that for most things, synthesis has mostly stopped, and it's more like a concentration effect or a breakdown effect. So that's why we're aiming for that ripeness.
And what about the impact of ash? Have we learned anything new since last year?
Yeah, so some of you may have heard me say this before. So we collected some ash and we analyzed this by SPME GCMS. So you have to remember this is 50 degrees in a glass vial stirring. And for up to a week, we could get some measurable volatile phenols from this ash. Tom Collins actually went a step further. He did the same thing and he made some ash. And he actually added different concentrations to small scale fermentations to see what happens to their volatile phenol composition. And he had ash that was less than 24 hours old, and those that were more than 7 days old, a week old. And as soon as the ash was a week old, it had no impact on the fermentations. So basically at this point, we know that if ash on grapes is more than a week old, it probably is not going to release any volatile phenols during your winemaking process. I mean, it's not a lot, excessive amount. I think we need to do some additional experiments, which I'm aiming to do this year, but that's what the data indicates. Now, if you have fresher ash than that, I'm still concerned that if you have visible ash on your grapes when you pick it and you want to process it in the winery, then I would be somewhat concerned if it's very fresh. Now, for ash, you know, last year we said, do you wash your grapes in the vineyard? Don't you wash your grapes in the vineyard? And we did some wash, no wash, but I don't have the data yet. But I'll be surprised if I see differences from what we did here, because even our wines, control wines, impacted wines that we made from RMI seem to be smoke impacted. So that puts a spanner in the wheel of a lot of stuff that I did, because our smoke that we got here was pretty heavy, but it wasn't fresh smoke. So I think the impact in our RMI vineyards were actually pretty low. I would say this, the question here is, if you have a lot of ash on your grape bunches, does that release enough volatile phenols in the atmosphere or the microclimate around the cluster that it allows an excess amount to absorb into your berry? Now, the thing is, we don't know. It releases volatile phenols, so that's possible. But now, if you wash it off, wet ash gives off more free volatile phenols than dry ash. So if you wash it off, now the ash is lying on the ground and it's wet. Is that better than just leaving it on the vine, on the grapes? And so I don't know. Unfortunately, that question I can't answer. I just didn't have the ideal experimental conditions for that.
Anita, what about blowing the ash off the grapes in the vineyard with air?
We tried, it didn't work very well. I mean, they stick. They seem to stick to the berries quite a bit. So when we just blow, we didn't have a lot of success. I mean, I can't tell you really how much we could. That's why we ended up rinsing, because that worked better with quite, powerful. We used quite a bit of power to rinse it off. I would say for me, the big concern is fresh ash on berries when you're doing processing. There, I think, if it's possible for you, if you are harvesting within a day of smoke exposure and you see a lot of visible ash, see if you can rinse it off before you process it. Even if it's in the picking bins at the winery, to give it a quick rinse if you can.
So you talked about setting up a sensory panel, and you talked about having standards that would be, not impacted or heavily impacted. Let's say there's a winery that was lucky enough not to have a heavily impacted wine last year, and this year they're worried. Is there a way to create a heavily impacted standard or place that someone can get one?
So we've tried with chemical standards, right? This is the problem with matrix and why we know that what we perceive as smoke taint is a very complex result of synergistic impacts of a lot of different compounds, both free and bound. Because when you actually try and spike wines with volatile phenols, you just don't get the same impact. You just don't get that ashtray character. So last year, we got grapes gifted from some vineyards that were heavily impacted. And we made larger quantities of wine here at the UC Davis Teaching and Research Winery. So if anybody is in need of a heavily impacted wine, we do have some. And we can definitely provide you with some to train your sensory panels. Because I find we actually have a good like low, medium, and high. I have more of the high than of the other levels. But it's very good to standardize and calibrate your people in that way, and so that they can know what is the distinctive descriptors for smoke taint. What we found in our first session when I was training some winemakers is that many times there's a perception of what a wine should taste like. And because the wine doesn't taste like that, they want to say, but this is the smoke impact, but it had none of the smoke impact characteristic attributes. That's a perception, right? That's not what you're rating. Smoke taint is only the smoke impact, especially, if you're rating your own wines for your own winemaking, that's something different because you know what the wine is supposed to taste like. And you see when there's a quality impact, because it's true. Sometimes smoke impact is sub-threshold, I basically want to say. It does not, you don't perceive it as smoke. It's just a muteness of the fruit flavors. It's just disjointness of the body. That mid palate is gone. You have this weird bitterness and this weird astringency at the front of the mouth. And it's true, that could be due to smoke, but it's actually sub-threshold. It's not classic smoke taint. If you're evaluating somebody else's bucket fermentations, obviously you can't assume what that wine was supposed to look like, and you can't make assumptions about the body and the structure. So those kind of things we sort of leave out if we're specifically evaluating for smoke taint, yes or no. If that makes sense, I hope so. Any other questions?
Do you have any other information regarding methods of analysis or anything that you want to impart to the group that's here today?
I would say it's a work in progress. Look, the key 7 free volatile phenols and the key 6 bound volatile phenols and the total acid hydrolysis method, they all correlate. They're all those compounds, individual compounds, when I've done any kind of statistical analysis, correlate with the sensory evaluation of smoke impact and smoke taint. What we're concerned about is finding out, is that all we should measure? Are there others that could be even better indicators of? And so that is really still in progress. We're all trying to optimize. I mean, currently I need to write this publication and we're looking into just grape prep, grape homogenates, how to prepare them for SPME or liquid extraction analysis. The analysis itself on the instrument is pretty straightforward. Sometimes I think it's sample prep that's more a problem, because sample prep can vary among labs. And we know from what we've done in our lab, if you do a grape homogenate and you let it stand, you have a 30-minute window, and then the change actually in extraction is significant, that you have too much variability. So you really need to standardize everything as much as you can to have consistent results. And so that can also lead to variability among different labs. So I would say, the labs that do analysis, you can trust the results. The differences are due to small things like that, sample prep and other differences. We do use calibration standards and internal standards, we all do, but it doesn't make up for all instrument related differences either. That's also something to remember. Everything you see is a range. The things we need to determine really now is what's baseline, what's normal for, say, a Cabernet Sauvignon full body stout. What is elevated enough to result in a quality impact? And that's the range we need to determine, so that people can use that kind of information to determine for their contracts, for their growth contracts, for insurance purposes, for, you know, just also any evaluations and decisions regarding winemaking, picking, etc. And that's what we don't have. We need that for all our main varieties. Basically what I call the bookends, right? This starts having a quality impact. This is normal. And you're going to have a range in between that. And there will always be a range.
So please, if other people have questions, we still have plenty of questions we could ask Anita, but we get to chat with her on a pretty regular basis. So if you have questions, please put them in chat and we'll read them. Anita, you talked about some methods that you've tried out for mitigating the effects of smoke impact. And I think all of us here on this call have heard of new methods coming out and being marketed to wineries on a pretty regular basis. So my question to you is, if you were one of these people sitting at a winery, you have smoke impacted wine, or you think you might have smoke impacted wine. When you're looking at these opportunities, let's call them, how would you go about testing with your own wine, whether they work for you or not?
So I think I would do bench trials. You know, this is the thing also, what I found even with the, you know, I looked at reverse osmosis and spinning cone and molecular imprinted polymers and activated charcoal. Those are the 4 that I've looked at. And I used different wines to assess the efficacy of them. And depending on the wine, the efficacy actually differed. So that's the thing, right? Even if you find something that works really well for one wine, it doesn't mean it doesn't work well for another wine. And at this point of time, almost everything that's out there, you know, it's things we're already using for other purposes. So it's sort of seeing if it catches some of the volatile phenols or builds up the body and hides some of the impact of the volatile phenols. I think there's a lot of things out there that in the really low to medium impact could really just be enough so that it hides or removes enough and builds enough back up so that you have a wine that's sellable, especially if you have different labels and you can sell it, you know, in a different range or something like that. Because I do think most of these treatments do have some kind of a quality impact. I mean, there's been now the milk finding looks really interesting. So I want to go and test that out. There's people that really say that it works really well. I know there's a few resin treatments out there that are being said to be quite successful. So I want to try some of them out as well. It's possible that some of these techniques work really well. I'll be surprised if, you know, any of those would just remove all volatile phenols free and bound. You have the perfect wine as if it never saw smoke, you know, and it didn't take out anything else. You know, I don't think that exists. And sometimes in the marketing, it sounds like it does exist, but I don't think that exists. But I do think there's plenty of things out there that, depending on the wine, could potentially just remove enough of the smoke impact, uplift the fruit or build back the body so that you actually have a good wine after treatment. Remember, we don't have to remove everything. You don't have to remove all the bound volatile phenols or all the free volatile phenols. You just need it to go back in the range where it doesn't have a quality impact. That bookend range, you know, normal versus high enough impact that it actually starts decreasing the quality and it's impacted. That's what you want. You just need, and for a low impact wine, that may be a small amount that you need to remove. So that's the other thing. You always want to treat as little as possible, right? Otherwise, you do start having an overall quality impact, which is not good. The problem here is, unfortunately, we all now have to be fortune tellers. Because you treat something, now it seems good, but you need to know that it's good for the lifetime of that wine. And that's the tricky bit. You know, how much of the bound, how much is left? And this is why you need to know what is the total or the bound number, how much is left, And if you know what is normal, then it's much easier to go, okay, there's only this much left. It's in the normal range. So I'm not concerned about the lifetime of this wine. Even if somebody's going to put it away for 2 years or 5 years, I'm okay with it. But if you don't know what's normal or baseline range, it's really difficult to try and make that decision whether that wine will be okay for its lifetime. Right?
And knowing the bound will help you make a decision as to whether you need to treat all of your wine a little bit or a little bit of your wine a lot, right? Because if there's a lot of bound, treating, a little bit, a lot, you could end up with the bound hydrolyzing over time and get the problem back, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, so this is the thing. And this is why the total or the bound number for me is very important, because for most wines, for most grapes, the largest amount is still in the bound form. We saw that about 20 to 35% max will release of the bound during the winemaking process. So that still leaves a large amount of bound. And for low impact wines, I many times see bound numbers that's anyway in the range. They're in the normal range. You tasted them, they're slightly impacted. Then I know that if you just treat them and just get it below that edge, there is really not a reservoir of more bound that's going to give you a problem in the future. It's really the medium to high impact that is very difficult, very difficult.
There is one last question in the chat. It says, does your crystal ball indicate when the industry might have a good data set for background concentrations and concentrations above background that would be offensive? Or in her case, offensive being poor quality.
Yeah, so we're working on it. So after this year, what my plan is, and I hope the industry will understand that this is going to evolve, right? My plan is to, after the first year of baseline data, to release that with the caveat and the understanding that that's only 1 year's data. And we know there's seasonal impact and there's regional impacts, and we won't be able to cover all the regions. And then really just every year build upon that and expand that data and add to it. So basically every year of additional data that we add to it, that data will become more robust, right? And more trustworthy, if I can put it that way. But I think I don't want to wait until I have 5 seasons of data to release it. I just think that's ridiculous, right? So I feel like by next season, I hope that I can give you a range of what I think is normal, but it would be, the depth of the data would not be what I would recommend. And we are trying to collaborate with other entities to build upon that data, because I'm just one lab and we need as more labs we can, the better. So we're doing our best. As far as what's the bookends on the top end for quality impact, that is actually a very, very difficult thing to solve. We think in different varieties and different wine styles, we will have to determine and have different values, because it's so matrix dependent how the smoke expression work. And the best way to do that is to have a smoke impacted wine, a control and an impacted wine naturally, and do dilution effect and evaluate that to determine when you actually have that quality impact of the wine. So it's something we're going to have to intentionally do. It's part of the SCRI grant we submitted, and we're only going to know whether we have funding in January of 2022, but I'm pretty positive we will. So that will probably be 2 years before we have good data on quality impact in wines, but we're working on it. As we get things and we trust the data, we will release it with the caveat that it's not as robust as we would like it to be, and we will build upon that data over time.
So Anita, we have about 1 minute left. One more quick question we're going to try and sneak in is from the chat. Is the hydrolysis of bound to free volatile phenols dependent on enzymatic activity?
No, so we, oh, you mean in the wines? So when we,
So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's both. It's a little bit of enzymatic activity. It's also pH related because wine actually has what we see as a low-ish pH, but it's not very low. But this is part of why, because enzymatic activity gets inhibited, basically when you have 10% of alcohol, it's basically inhibited. So in the beginning, you get some release through normal enzymatic activity in the wine, but then it is also that pH effect. But that's also probably, you get that synergistic impact in the beginning, and then it really starts slowing down. The release during the aging of the wine is slower, much slower than what we see during wine processing itself. And I think it's because during wine processing, you do still have some enzymatic impact. So I should say, when I evaluated different enzymes to see if I could release some of the more of the bound to the free, that was in wines, already made wines. So, and a lot of these kind of enzymes are really really inhibited in those conditions. So that's the problem.
Great. Thank you. So I think that's bringing us to the end of the program. And I'd like to thank Karen Block and Caroline Furman for organizing the program today, and for Karen stepping in and helping out with the hosting activities. And to thank Anita for her time and answering questions. I'd also like to thank our partners in Extension Industry Relations. If you would like to be a partner to help us produce these programs that provide timely and useful information to the industry, please let Karen or Caroline know, or Anita. And I'd also like to say this is the last right now of our scheduled office hours with Dave and Anita programs. If you have ideas of subjects that you would like to hear about, please let Karen Block know or Caroline Furman know, so we can schedule more of these programs probably at this point after harvest this year. So Karen, I'm not sure if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to add.
The other thing I wanted to add is to please take a moment to complete the survey that Caroline has put into the chat. Your feedback helps us to provide relevant and informative content going forward. And just a quick note that we will be emailing a recording of today's program or a link to it actually within 48 hours. So thank you very much for attending today. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them our way.
Yes, absolutely. Because as you hear, we don't have all the answers, but we'll try our best to answer it with the information that we have available at this point in time. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.